Very, very interesting thoughts, and clearly a lot of that came from your dissertation work, or some parts of it. I want to jump a little bit to some musical influences. How many have heard Vijay's music? Just raise your hand. Oh, that's wonderful. So I'd say that's probably 20 or 30% of the audience. So you had some musical influences in your life that led you to the music that you're now creating. And you create music in an awful lot of genres, by the way, from classical to jazz and some things in between. Who were some of your influencers?
Let's see, well, I've had a lot, I just had so many different things that happened to me in the course of becoming a musician. I started out on Western classical violin when I was very little, and so I was influenced by that, and then I was listening to music on the radio and trying to decode it and figure out how to play it on the piano, and so it was a lot of pop music and soul and rock and very early hip-hop. I was really into Prince and into Michael Jackson and into the Police. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so sort of just about everything that you could hear on the radio was fair game, I guess. But then when I got into jazz, through our high school had a jazz ensemble. That's how a lot of people get into jazz nowadays. It's hard to come by it otherwise. But when I was in high school, I just had a few lessons with a local jazz pianist to kind of orient myself in the language of this music, because I didn't really know anything about it. I mean, I'd been improvising on the piano my whole life, but I didn't really have any direct connection to this history or this tradition or this language. So he loaned me a few records. The first was, well, I remember there were two. It was Red Garland Trio. Red Garland used to play with Miles Davis in the 50s. And the other was Keith Jarrett Trio. It was something that it was actually the Standards Trio Volume 1, which came out in the early 80s. And they were so different, and yet somehow both of these guys had played with Miles Davis. I was like, well, how is this even possible? So then I was looking at, well, who else played with Miles Davis? Oh, this guy, Herbie Hancock. Wait, the guy who did Rocket? Because that was what I knew about him, is that in the early days of MTV, there was this video where this guy played a few notes on the keyboard and there were these dancing robots. I was like, this is the same guy? So then I checked out all these things that he had done with Miles Davis, and then afterward, and I found this album that he had just put out around that time. This was mid to late 80s. There was something just called Herbie Hancock Quartet. And that was just sort of it was beguiling to me because it was so advanced. I mean, there were songs, but there was also a lot of really pretty wild improvisation going on where the song was obscured, But then I was like, well, what are these songs? There's something called Well You Needn't by Thelonious Monk, and something else called Round Midnight, also by Thelonious Monk. So who is this guy? Thelonious Monk. What a weird name. And so I looked him up, and right then, it changed my life. That music changed my life. I mean, I still think about him every day, 25 years later. He's the most important musician of the last 100 years, in my opinion. And his music has so much mystery and so much clarity, so much depth, and so much playfulness and rigor. So he's the one. He's number one.
Fantastic. Fantastic story. We're both from Rochester, New York, by chance, as we know. And I got to thinking earlier today, about what led you somewhere early, maybe in childhood or early in your career, to sort of combine music and science in the way that you've done some of your research and some of your thinking here. And of course, I immediately say, well, Rochester's got Eastman School of Music on one side, and it's got RIT on the other, and you've got technology and music all in that area. So. I wonder if that influenced you, or what. This is a very unusual thing. You don't see someone want to research this in this way often, and also be a musician.
Yeah, well, like I said, I first went into physics, and I thought that was what I was going to do. And I did that basically because I was kind of good at math growing up. And I guess I was groomed for the sciences. My father was, he had a Ph.D. in pharmaceutical chemistry, and he worked for pharmaceutical corporations. And a lot of people in what was then a very young Indian American or Indian immigrant community, a lot of people like my parents were in science and technology, and some of them were in medicine. So most of our family friends were, from that community, were in a similar career path in the sciences. And that's partly also because what happened in 1965 in the Immigration Act, which suddenly opened the door to all these non-Western immigrants. The first people who were allowed in were people like my parents, so people who had that kind of technical and scientific knowledge because the US was trying to beat the Russians. It was basically that kind of thing. So there was this initial, what was called brain drain from India and from other non-Western countries to the US for this exact reason. And so that's why there are all these stereotypes about Indians being science and math nerds. It can't be because all Indians are. I mean, there are a billion of us, so it can't all be like that. But basically the first ones who came here basically were. So I was one of them, and I'm not afraid to admit it, I guess. And so that kind of maybe steered the initial path I was on, is that influence of that community and my parents' values about education, and specifically about science being like the way of the future, and so on, and a path to stability, and a way to get a job after college, and all these kinds of things. I mean, we were a new community, so it's not like, if I had just moved to this country and I had kids, I wouldn't have said, go ahead, be artists, you guys, it's going to be great. It actually, not only is it a huge risk, but especially for people like me, there was no obvious point of reference or precedent or anything. It was a bit of a new thing. So, for one thing, I'm getting back to answering your question. I mean, for one thing, when I came of age, when I was in my 20s, and I was trying to understand my relationship to this African American music, this was that music played such a pivotal role in African American struggle for identity and for self-determination, and it was a way of articulating their identity. And that sort of, for me, was a way in for myself, to be myself, and to kind of use the music as a way to express who I am, But then this happened while I was also in physics. So I was ready to leave physics, and then suddenly had this opportunity. And it was partly because of whom I fell in with at UC Berkeley. David Wessel used to run the Computer Music Research Center there, and he himself was a pioneer in the field of music perception and cognition. So he kind of influenced me, at least to look at this stuff. But then I was also just interested in my own questions about what is music? What's it made of? How does it work? These basic fundamental questions that are useful for us to know about if we're trying to make music. I think they're just fundamental questions that every musician should think about. I just was fortunate to get to do it on a fellowship for a while at UC Berkeley, and also get to play gigs at the same time, so I was lucky.